So I wanted to go over some of the more commonly seen promulgated forms, such as the TOO or the T00, if you're being specific, the T56, which is your owner's policy rejection form, and then the T64, which is, of course, the Texas disclosure. Now, the basic manual itself has quite a few promulgated forms, and these are only 3 of them. But these are probably the most common 3 that you're going to see in your office. And I want to make sure everybody's aware of how these forms work, of what the information you need on these forms are, and how to complete them. So we're going to run through each form and how to complete them in their entirety. We're going to start first with the TOO, which is your verification of services rendered. Now, TOOs are generally used in out-of-county transactions, but those of you that are closing CZE deals will also see TOOs, but truthfully, the form is used to indicate premium splits, or at least the payment of the funds for a service that's being provided by another company. So this is all pursuant to procedural rule number P22. And specifically P22F is the subsection in that rule that requires us to use a TOO when we're closing a file where we're paying another title company, not just an underwriter or ourselves, but another title company. So again, P22F is stating that the person rendering the services shall have presented to the company, the title company, a written itemized statement or invoice which clearly sets forth in detail the actual services rendered and billed for. So essentially, anytime we have an out-of-county file or a CZE file where we're paying another title plant for evidence, because that's usually the most common use for the TOO, we need to make sure we fill one of these out. Now, some of you might have filled out a TOO before, but I'm going to go over exactly how these forms are filled out. That way there's no confusion on how these are actually, finished and created. So when you have an out-of-county file or a CZE file, you're going to see a T00 in file scan, right? And the TOO is essentially laid out in a 2-page document. There are 3 sections to the document. Now, generally, when you have one of these, section 1 will already be completed for you, right? So this is information that's provided by the out-of-county company who's either furnishing title evidence, closing the transaction, or examining the title itself. Now, most commonly, you're going to see this first option being selected, furnishing title evidence. And again, that's because of most out-of-county files, this is really the only thing that the agent that's requesting payment is completing for your file, right? So before I actually go over all this, this is actually a TOO cheat sheet that you can find on the intranet, but I will make sure everybody that's here has a copy of this today. This is truthfully good information. It's information that you're going to want to keep somewhere on your desktop or in a file folder somewhere. This cheat sheet is pretty easy to understand and will make filling out one of these forms pretty easy. So we're just going to go top to bottom on this to make sure that everybody knows exactly how this form is laid out. First, in section 1, the address of the location where the work was done. This is generally already completed by the title company or the abstractor. So this is going to be their business address. And they're also going to have a file number for their file as well, and they're going to fill that in. Now, section number 2, or I'm sorry, line number 2 in section 1 is probably the most important line here on section 1, because this will tell you exactly what the split is to the company that's providing this evidence for you. So most of the time, this is going to be a percentage, right? So they're going to take a total percentage of the title premium, and that's going to be remaining after the remittance to the underwriter. So what that means is obviously we split 15% of our total premium to the underwriter, and they will take a certain percentage after that 15% is already taken out, right? Now, it's not always going to be a percentage. Sometimes they take a flat fee, but I will tell you 9 times out of 10, it's going to be a percentage. Section 3 is already filled out by them. Again, it's just listing the company name and address, as well as their Texas Department of Insurance number. Now, as far as the information we have to complete on that TOO, we're really concerned with section 2. That's really the most important section, because this is the section that you're going to have to actually manually fill in information that is specific to your file. So we're going to start with line number 4, which is the one that contains the date of your policy, the county code, and the GF number for your file. So date of policy. Now, this is not something that you probably are going to have when it comes time to fill one of these out, right? Because you close a transaction and generally the policy is not completed at the point that you close this transaction, but these TOOs really need to be completed as soon as possible. So in this particular section, you don't really need to put the date of the policy. You can get away with the recording date. So the recording date on the actual recordable document itself, right? The warranty deed, the deed of trust. Now, the recording date is the date that is stamped on the document once it's recorded with the county clerk, right? So if you have a file that you're closing that has a county that does not e-record, you're going to need to make sure you get that document back before you fill out your TOO, right? Because you're not going to know the actual date that that document was recorded. So for example's sake, if you're closing in Guadalupe County and you FedEx a document out to them today, it's highly unlikely, obviously, that they're going to record the document today, right? They're probably going to record the document tomorrow or Friday. But typically, you're not going to have that information until you get that document back from the clerk, right? So any recordable document that's recorded has the actual recording date on there. Usually, it's either on the very top of page 1 or the very last page of the document is the date that they put that information in there. So again, a data policy is going to be your recording date. County code, this is found in the TLTA Manual Appendix Table 7, but I actually have that county code table saved, and I will make sure you guys also get a copy of this as well. So all you'll have to do is find the county that the file closed in, and you're going to use that county code on the TOO, right? So if this file closed in Camp County, Texas, you would put 063 in, I'm sorry, my computer's being a little slow here. You'd put 063 in the county code blank right up here. But again, I'll make sure you guys have a copy of that. It's just something easy to save. It's a little bit of a pain to go to the TLTA Basic Manual every single time to get that information. Now, this is generally, these 2 blanks here are the most common mistakes that are made when you're filling out a TOO. Most people think it's usually people making mistakes with the premiums. We'll get to that in a second. It's truthfully because people just aren't entering this information. But in order for this form to be fully completed, we need to make sure that not only is the recording date there for the data policy, but the county code needs to be there as well. The next section in line 4 is pretty common. I mean, you just put your GF number there. Whatever the GF number for the active order is, that's where that goes. Now, number 5 is issue type. Now, again, more commonly, it's going to be out of county, right? Where you're getting title evidence from a Texas agent and a county where capital title is not licensed. So we would just check the box that best applies here. But I would say 99 times out of 100, it's going to be the first box for out of county. Now, line number 6 is where you disclose your owner's title policy and mortgagee policy liability amounts and the premiums themselves. So the easiest way to complete this section is to go into your active file in RamQuest and pull a premium report. And the easiest way to do that is just to go to your document screen, and you would look for an item that says premium report, right? If you just type in premium report, you're just selecting the first option here. When you print a premium report, which most of you are probably familiar with, you're looking for a couple different pieces of information on this order itself, right? So when it comes to section 6, we need to fill out a couple different pieces of information. Number 1, the owner's title policy liability, right? This is really the sale price of the property because, again, we're in a promulgated rate system, and the owner's title policy amount is promulgated based off the sale price of the property. So your liability, in this example's sake, would be $1 million. Your mortgagee's policy liability is generally based off the sale price of the property. Again, this is not always the case. You might have overridden the loan policy override, but generally speaking, it's safe to bet that your liability amount will be the loan amount, right? So again, on the premium report, you can pull that information. So in this example, that's $450,000. So I'd put $1 million here. I'd put $450,000 here. As far as the premiums themselves are concerned, this is where you're putting the actual dollar amount of the premium, right? So not including endorsements, because there's a different line for endorsements we'll get to in a second, but just the actual premium amount on the TOO, which again, you can find on the premium report itself, right? So on a premium report, there's 2 columns that you're really the most concerned with. The number 1 is the mortgagee column, and this is all the charges that are going onto the mortgagee's policy. And then you have an owner's column, and this is a summary of all the charges that are going to be collected for the owner's policy, right? So when we're looking for the actual premium, we're looking for the actual premium itself, right? So for the owner, this would be $58.61, right? So on the TOO, I'd put $58.61 in this blank here. For the mortgagee's policy, because we're simultaneously issuing, it's only $100, right? So I'd only put $100 there. But in a refinance transaction where maybe it's out of county, you would need to put the total amount there. So don't just assume it's $100. It's literally on the premium report, whatever you're collecting for the actual premium itself, not including endorsements, that's where that information goes. Now the endorsements here are really just a total of all of the endorsements for both policies, right? So I would take a calculator and I would add all these endorsements together, both the 293.05, the 140.70, the both 25 and the 20 and 5. And those all would be added together and go into the endorsement line right here. After you put all that information there, you would sum all these totals together and it goes in the total right here, right? So that's the total amount of premium that you've collected. And if you wanted to check yourself, the total premium is actually disclosed on the premium report itself, right? So this will tell you how much the total premium being collected for the transaction is. And all your totals here, additive, should equal the same total here as it does on the premium report right here. Now, there's 2 more blanks to complete in line 6. Number 1 is final amount remaining after remittance to the underwriter. So what you're going to do is you're going to take 85% of this total right here, because that will be the amount of premium left over after the underwriter split. So for those of you that aren't familiar, the underwriter takes 15% of every single deal that we close. So that's why it says 85% of total, right? Because the underwriter is taking 15%. Easy way to do that on a premium report. The premium report itself will indicate the total split to the underwriter, right? So $1,014.43 being the actual 15% split to the underwriter. So an easy way to find that information is just to subtract these 2 totals, and that will give you 85% left over. Now, if that's confusing, don't worry. It sounds very confusing, but if you're having trouble, reach out to me directly, and I'm more than happy to go over that again with you individually. So the last blank we're going to have to complete is the final amount paid to the agent entity doing the work. So remember on page 1 where we said on line number 2 they had a percentage filled in here, right? So it might be 30%, might be 40%, might be 50%. What you do is you would take that percentage of the total left over after the underwriter split and put that line in right here. This is telling the out-of-county company that, hey, I know that you have a 40% split, so 40% after my underwriter remittance is this amount of money, which means this is the amount of money you guys are receiving for providing title evidence for my deal. Again, if this is confusing, let me know directly. I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time explaining any more than that. Just know that generally speaking, that's how this section works. And this is definitely the most complex section of the TOO, but it honestly is very easy if you just pull the premium report because it's all right there, right? All the information you need is readily available here. Line number 7 is really just used to list our company name and then the corporate address. So on this cheat sheet, which you guys are going to have, you literally can just copy this word for word in line number 7, and you would have satisfied this requirement. Our TDI number is 1877619. That is the Capital Title of Texas number, and it will always be that unless the regulations change, which I highly doubt. Section 3 is probably the easiest section to complete. And again, we're really just restating the information about us, right? Our company name, our corporate address, and then our TDI number. We're going to throw our file number down here, our GF number, the same GF number you would have put in this section here. And then either the escrow officer or the assistant will sign at the bottom. And the date will not be the date that you signed the document, but the date that you closed and funded the transaction. So if that's confusing, feel free to type questions in chat. This is a great place to ask questions, and I will address them at the end of the webinar. But again, you guys are going to have a copy of this cheat sheet to use moving forward when you start to close more deals where a TOO is required. So the next form we're going to talk about is the T56. It's most commonly known as the owner policy rejection form. And for those of you that don't know, believe it or not, the owner's policy is optional in Texas. It is not a requirement to actually have an owner's policy if you're purchasing a piece of property. Now, if you have a transaction where the buyer does not want an owner's title policy, we're going to need to make sure we have a T56 executed and saved into file scan, right? And that's pursuant to procedural rule P65C, which is saying, again, if somebody's acquiring title to the property and they refuse an owner's policy, we are required per TDI to fill out a T56 form and throw it in the file scan. Now, this is generally a summary of what a T56 form looks like, but I'll show you what that looks like in RamQuest as well, because you can actually get the T56 form in your document screen, just like we did with the premium report. So we're looking for literally a form that says T56, right? It's the OTP rejection form. It's going to ask you a couple questions when you pull the document in regards to how much the premium were for the loan policy, how much the premium was for the owner's policy if they were to reject it. Just put that information in as it applies. And generally, once this has been generated, all you'll have to do is print this out, have the buyer sign it, and save it into file scan. Make sure you label it accordingly in file scan, right? We want to label this owner's policy rejection form, form T56. The more plainly that you can label that, the better. Now, I will say, if you are finding yourself closing a lot of transactions where you have an owner's policy that's being rejected, right? So maybe it's an investor and they're just really not wanting owner's policies. You need to understand that you're doing a lot of that work for free, right? Because at a title company, we really make money on the premiums of the insurance policies themselves, right? So if all you're collecting from one client is escrow fees every time, it might not be worth it for you guys to continue to close that transaction. And truthfully, even if the owner's policy form is, or the owner's policy itself is optional, we always want to be encouraging coverage for the buyers, right? Because truthfully, the owner's policy itself is the best insurance deal in the insurance industry. And that's, I guess, as a disclaimer, that is my opinion. But truthfully, it's a one-time premium. You pay it up front at closing, and a lot of the time, the buyer doesn't even pay it, right? Because honestly, it's the sort of thing that 99% of the time, yeah, sure, you're never going to have to use the owner's policy itself, but when you need it, you're going to be glad you have it. And personally, I found a lot of success just using that one phrase, this last bullet point here. Again, 99% of the time, you'll never use it, but when you need it, you'll be glad you have it, right? Again, we don't want to be, I guess, representing ourselves as attorneys, right? We don't want to tell people what they should do, but we should encourage people by educating themselves about how protected the owner's policy is. To, hopefully they can make a decision to actually purchase an owner's policy, or at least have an owner's policy tied in with their sales contract somehow. But again, the one thing to take away from this is if you have somebody that does not want an owner's policy, you need to make sure that that Form T56 ends up in file scan. If you do not, and when your file gets audited by TDI, they will instantly fail you. So just be super careful with that. Last one we're going to talk about as far as the promulgated form is concerned is the T64. Now, this is a form that I get a lot of questions on, and I can understand why. I mean, truthfully, when the CFPB came in and changed things, we didn't really do a good job as a state of educating escrow professionals how the T64 actually works, when it's required, when it's not, what needs to be on it, right? So the most common question I get in closings or with even escrow staff is, why does a T64 even exist, right? So let's go back to 2014, 2015, when the CFPB was considering actually introducing the federal closing disclosure and the TILA-RESPA integrated disclosure, or TRID, right? So when they actually went to go implement this information, before they did that, what they did is went to the upper East Coast of the United States. They took a survey of 10-ish states up there and said, hey guys, how are you normally closing real estate transactions? How are you disclosing your title premiums? How are you disclosing all this information, right? And it turns out the people in New York that close title policies there do so much differently than we do things here in Texas, right? As you know, Texas is under a completely different set of rules than most of the United States. I would say 48 states in the United States are all ALTA states, right? American Land Title Association. Texas and California are special, and we have our own. So when this was happening, Texas had lobbyists going and talking to the CFPB saying, hey, we don't really disclose premiums that way, right? We're a promulgated system. We simultaneously issue policies. And the CFPB just kind of told us to take a hike and to deal with it. So in order for the actual transaction to be more apparent and clear and understandable to the consumer, quote unquote, we introduced procedural rule number 73, which states that the Texas disclosure is required on transactions where a federal closing disclosure is required in a transaction, right? And we'll get more to procedural rule 73 on the next slide. But essentially, the Texas disclosure provides additional disclosures and acknowledgments required in Texas, right? It provides for what exactly are the title policy amounts, right? How much are you actually charging for an owner's policy, and how much are you actually charging for a lender's policy? Because it's very confusing on the closing disclosure. I'm sure you guys have seen where, we have to charge the full amount to the buyer, and then we have to do an OTP adjustment credit on page 3. And if you think that's confusing to you guys as title professionals, imagine how confusing that is for somebody who has no idea what a title company even is, right? So this is why we want to make sure we understand how the Texas disclosure works. So 2 main things to take away from this slide. Number 1, the Texas disclosure is not required on cash deals. And the reason why is because of P73. We'll get to that in a second. And the Texas disclosure is not required on finance transactions where the closing disclosure requirements do not apply, right? So if it's a hard money lender that originates less than 4 loans a year, they're not required to use a CD per the CFPB regulations and TRID regulations. So the Texas disclosure, again, is pretty congruent with procedural rule 73. This is really the new procedural rule that introduced the Texas disclosure as a requirement when the closing disclosure form is required in the state of Texas, right? So one of the things I want you guys to take away from this is, again, this first bullet point here is a word-for-word copy of P73. If you go look it up in the basic manual, this is literally the first line. And I'm going to read it to you guys. When a settlement agent is required to use a federal closing disclosure form in a settlement in Texas, the settlement agent must also prepare a Form T64, right? So if we're taking a contrapositive, which is the opposite of what the statement says, If you are not required to use a closing disclosure form, then you also are not required to use a T64, right? I think that's a very confusing thing. I think most people thought when TRID was introduced, the T64 needs to be on all your closings, but it truthfully doesn't. It only applies to closings where you are required to use a closing disclosure form as your settlement statement. Now, the next most common question we get with the T64 is what exactly does the T64 need to have on it, right? Well, there's really three main pieces of information that T64 needs to disclose. Number one, it needs to accurately disclose the Texas title insurance premiums, right? And that's on page 1 of the Texas disclosure, where it'll say owner's policy amount is X, loan policy amount is Y, and the endorsements we're collecting for the deal are on Z, right? Those are automatically populated for you in RamQuest, and those are not really anything that you guys have to edit. Provided that you're entering your premiums and endorsements correctly in the premium screen, this is not something you're going to have to override manually. Now, the second one that's required is to separately itemize all other fees fees and charges paid to the settlement agent, which may have been combined on the closing disclosure. So this is not common at Capital Title, right? Because we have all our fees pretty much split out, right? Our tax certificate fees on a separate line, our escrow fees on a separate line, our e-recording fees on a separate line. So this isn't something that you're really going to have to worry about here at Capital Title. But there are other title companies that charge a one-time closing fee, right? They say our closing fee is $500, but it comprises of the escrow fee, a courier fee, a copy fee, a wire fee. That's really what this rule is referring to, right? So if you have a one-time lump sum fee that you're charging on the closing disclosure, and you're actually paying multiple bills out of that one fee, then every single one of those fees need to be itemized on the T64. Again, this is not something that you're going to have to worry about as much at Capital Title because we split all of our lines out on our closing disclosure, right? We're not lumping in the tax cert and the escrow fee and all this stuff on one big charge. We split those out. The third requirement is to disclose all payments of portions of the premium or real estate commission to third parties, right? So on deals where you have out-of-county transactions, right, where you have a TOO that's being completed, the title plant and the out-of-county desk automatically go into RamQuest and put that split into RamQuest for you so that when you generate your T64, you don't need to worry about actually doing the math and revising your T64 to show that, hey, Bandera County Title is providing title evidence for me, and this is how much money that they're to be paid out of the premium. Again, not having to worry about that. Really, this is where most people fall into a trap in the sense that they don't include this very last part here, the real estate commission to third parties, right? So what this means is if you have a disbursement authorization in your file and you are being asked to cut a check to anybody else other than the broker on the transaction, you need to disclose every single person who is being paid a part of that commission. Now, the T64 is not as concerned with the amount of money they're getting paid. They're concerned with the payee, right? So this is not something you're going to have to worry about if you are properly utilizing the commission itemization screen in the closing disclosure. And I'll show you what I mean by that. For those of you who don't know, you can actually itemize your DA in the closing disclosure form itself. And it's done in the same screen that the commission is done in, right? So the little green house icon is really where our commission is in the closing disclosure. And when this screen pulls up, you're going to see that at the bottom of the screen, there's a couple different lines for both the seller and the buyer realtor commission, right? So if I had a DA sitting in front of me, I could go split the DA in this screen, right? Say I have $5,000 in commission and $2,000 is going to one agent and $3,000 is going to the broker. Well, I could put $2,000 here to broker or the agent, $3,000 to broker. I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time explaining how this screen works, but if you'd like to learn how this screen works and learn how to itemize the realtor check outside of this training, please approach me directly, shoot me an email. I'm happy to schedule a training with you and I can remote in and walk you through it. Because not only by completing this section will it allow your T64 to be completed more accurately and according to the TDI regulation, but it will also allow check writing to automatically split out your commission checks on the back end, right? So you're not going to have to do any of that manual work in check writing when you go to fund a file. It will automatically be split out for you. Again, I'm just going to reiterate, if you split out your DA here, you will not need to manually override the T64. But if you do not, and you just keep the two broker amounts there, and you're going to do the work in the back end and check writing, which again, you're more than welcome to do, but it truthfully is not as efficient, you're going to need to make sure that you revise your T64 form to reflect that. So what I mean by that is, and again, I'm going to pull up an example of the T64 here. On page 2 of the T64, there is a section for real estate commission disbursement, right? And this section right here needs to have every person that's getting any cut of the real estate transaction, right? So if they're receiving any sort of commission at all, their name needs to be here, whether that's Keller Williams, whether that's Hearts and Hands, whether that's the actual agent, any of the common things that you guys are seeing, that needs to be disclosed here, right? So if they're a payee on your DA, they need to end up in this section right here. That is what P73 is really saying. Again, if you are using the itemization screen correctly in the closing disclosure, you will not need to come manually edit this information. But if you are not, when you go to pull your title documents, you will need to come in here and edit this information manually in order to be compliant with P73. Now, I know that's a lot of information in regards to the Texas disclosure, so if any of that information is confusing, please ask a question in the chat, or if you have some more specific questions and you'd like to address them one-on-one, that's fine as well. Just shoot me an email, shoot me a text message. I'm happy to set up a training time with you guys. Now, before we start our next section, which is going to be surveys, and everything around a survey, the elements of an acceptable survey, why the T47 affidavit matters, how to review a survey yourself, and common policy endorsements to use with surveys. I'm going to give everybody a couple minutes just to say if you have any notes that you wanted to ask a question about any of those common promulgated forms, the TOO, the T56, or the T64, feel free to put those in the chat now. I'm going to give us about 30 seconds, and then we're going to move on with surveys. Okay, so we're going to go ahead and move on, and we're going to start talking about surveys themselves. Now, surveys are generally the most common question that underwriters receive from escrow staff on a day-to-day basis, and it's honestly a topic that I personally receive a lot of questions on as well. So I want to make sure everybody understands how surveys work, what's the acceptable form of the survey, what are the things the survey needs to show, what do some of the words mean, what are some of the endorsements, why do they matter, what do they mean, right? Everybody knows what a survey is, but can you really break down a survey? Can you digest every part of a survey and every endorsement that goes onto a survey and what's required of it? That's really the important part. So we're going to start with some glossary terms here. We're going to start with either an encumbrance or an encroachment, right? So an encumbrance is a claim, lien, charge, or liability attached to and binding property, right? So an encumbrance would be like an electric easement or a cable easement, something that encumbers the land, right? So, is dominant over the land, that gives somebody the ability to come on and maintain their ownership, right? So that's really what that is. Again, a right or interest in the land, which may exist in one other than the owner, right? So electric companies have an easement on the property, and technically an easement is a form of ownership. We'll get to that in a second. A plat, now generally, if you see plat on a survey, that's referring to the actual plat map, right? So the map records of the subdivision showing lot dimensions, street setbacks, building setback lines, drainage ways, access ways, etc. Now, a survey itself is really, the technical term for a survey is called a survey plat. But colloquially speaking, if you hear plat, they're referring to the plat map. So the bird's eye of the whole subdivision instead of the survey itself. Now, an easement is generally a right to cross or otherwise use someone else's land for a specified purpose, right? So an electric company has an easement to maintain the line that they have buried in your backyard. And I have this last bullet point here for bundle of sticks analogy because truthfully, this has been the most easy method for me to understand exactly what ownership is and how ownership works. So what I mean by that is imagine ownership in a property being a bundle of sticks, right? You have 20, 30 sticks in your hand. If the electric company has an easement, what you've effectively done is taken one of those sticks out of your hand and given it to the electric company, right? So you generally own the property still, right? You still have 29 sticks in your hands, but the electric company has the ability to come on to your property and maintain their easement because the easement itself is a form of ownership. So again, the bundle of sticks analogy is a great one. And if you want to talk about that more, feel free. It's more of a legal term, but just know that an easement itself is an actual term of ownership. Now, as far as the elements of an acceptable survey, first and foremost, it needs to be legible, right? We see this from time to time in our offices where you'll receive a survey that's 15 years old, it's been copied a million times, it's been faxed, somebody spilled coffee on it, and the dog ate half of it, right? If it's not legible, then we can't use it, right? It's pretty common sense. The scale itself should be appropriate. There is an actual scale on a survey itself, and I'll show you that in just a second because I have an example survey to show you. There needs to be a north arrow shown, right? We need to know the cardinal direction of the house. It's a common misconception that because the survey reads up and down, that up means north, but in truth, it does not. It needs to have a legend on it, right? We need to know what every single marking means, right? What does a dotted line mean? What does a line with 2 slashes through it mean? The survey needs to have a proper certificate. It needs to include the date, the name, the number, the seal, and the original signature of a registered professional land surveyor, or RPLS. So the RPLS number is really what that is, registered professional land surveyor number. So let's look at an example survey and show you exactly what I mean by some of the requirements for this. So we're going to go back to our PowerPoint really quick. Number 1, it needs to be legible, right? This survey is clearly legible. I can make out everything on here, every word, every line. I can see the cardinal directions, the scale, all that. Clearly, this satisfies the first requirement. It's legible. Number 2, the scale should be appropriate. Now, the scale looks like this. It generally will have the exact same layout where it's a black and white hashes here. But if you look closely, and I'm going to zoom in here for those of us who can't see like me, the scale will tell you per every inch, that's equal to how many feet, right? So this one says 1 inch is equal to 20 feet, right? The north arrow needs to be shown. That's what this is right here. This is a cardinal direction. This is saying that north is pointing in this way right here, right? So this way going that way. Again, common misconception that north is straight up, but it's truthfully not. Not on every survey. You need to look for the actual north arrow itself. There needs to be a legend, right? This is your legend itself. It will tell you what every marking actually means, right? So in the back of this property, we have a line with 2 slashes through it. But if you're not familiar with surveys, you're like, what the heck does this even mean? But if we go to our legend, it'll tell us exactly what it means. It means there's a wood fence in the back, right? Because there's a line with 2 slashes. So that's what a legend is. Proper certificate, including date, name, number, seal. That's generally found at the bottom of a survey itself. And this is generally the information that's missing from an existing survey more often than not, right? Most surveys are drawn on legal pieces of paper, but somehow, some way, people try and copy a legal piece of paper on letter, and it cuts off the bottom 3 inches of the page. And then our seal's gone, our signature's gone, our date of the survey's gone itself, and it wouldn't be considered an acceptable survey, right? We'll get to that in a second, but just know generally it's, again, at the bottom of the survey itself. It's not always necessarily true. I mean, it doesn't have to be at the bottom, but surveyor best practices says that it does need to be at the bottom of the survey. Now, as far as title insuring purposes are concerned, we're looking for even more information than what we just went over, right? We're looking to see, number 1, can we find a legal description on the survey itself? In this instance, we can find a legal description, and it's usually within the improvement itself, right? So wherever the house is, generally speaking, most of the time surveyors will put the legal description there. So lot 8, block 3, somewhere addition phase 3, this is our legal description. Needs to have permanent monuments, right? So if there's a monument that is noticeable on the property, that needs to be disclosed. So for example, there's a water meter in the front of the property here, right? This would be considered a monument, right? It's a permanent fixture that is readily identifiable from the road. That's what they consider a monument. We're looking for easements and building lines, right? And this clearly, the survey has both, right? It has sewer easements, it has utility easement, it has a building setback line on both all sides of the property, really. If there are any encroachments or protrusions on the survey itself, we would want to be aware of that, right? So an encroachment would be, you know, an improvement that is rapidly approaching a setback line or is close to an easement or something like that. A protrusion would really be where the improvement is over a building setback line or over an easement. So in this example, if this house was maybe 2 more feet out towards the bottom of the page, we would consider that a protrusion over the 20-foot building line in the front, right? If applicable, there needs to be a street address, right? Not all surveys will technically have street addresses. If the survey is generally on vacant land where the city hasn't assigned an address to it yet because it's a new development, that might be an instance where there's not a street address. But most actual improved properties will have a street address on them. In this survey, it's right here, Example Drive. Again, this is an example survey, so Example Drive. And again, if there are other visible matters, those also need to be disclosed on the survey, such as waterways, cemeteries, railroad tracks, apparent roads or paths. I'll tell you that these are probably a little more common on farm and ranch style deals or commercial deals, but it can apply to residential real property as well. So again, if there are other visible matters, they need to be disclosed on the survey. Now, before we move on, I want to talk a little bit about existing surveys and what's required with them, right? So first of all, with existing surveys, we need to make sure that we're complying with procedural rule P2. Now, this has to do mostly with our areas and boundaries coverage, and we'll get to that in a second. but it really speaks to the requirement to have a T47 affidavit, right? So the T47 affidavit is generally required with existing surveys, not because of title insurance purposes generally, right? Although if we're issuing the area and boundaries, we will need a T47, but we'll get to that in a second. The most common question or issue or pushback that you'll get from an agent regarding an existing survey is, do I really even need to have a T47 in your office? Why can't you just have one assigned at closing? Like, nobody really wants it. Nobody really cares. Like, nobody even knows what a T47 is. All those are absolutely terrible reasons, and I'll tell you why. I've copied paragraph 6, section C of the TREC 1 to 4 family contract. This is the paragraph that describes that if you have an existing survey, you also need to provide a T47 affidavit. And this is really where agents should really be a lot more concerned with making sure the T47 finds its way into not only the title company's hands, but also the buyer's hands. So I'm going to read just the very beginning part of this paragraph. So it says, within X number of days after the effective date of the contract, the seller shall furnish to the buyer and title company the existing survey and a T47 affidavit, right? So not only does the seller need to furnish us with the existing survey and T47, they also need to give it to the buyer. And if the seller fails to furnish either of those pieces of information within the time prescribed, the time being this many days after the effective date of the contract, the buyer shall obtain a new survey at seller's expense no later than 3 days prior to closing date. So a couple pieces of information there. If you have an existing survey, but the seller never furnishes a T47 affidavit, and it elapses past the number of days allowed that they've negotiated in this contract, then the seller may well have just paid for a new survey at the buyer's expense. Now, the way this paragraph reads is not an option, right? So if the seller does not comply, the buyer shall. That is a triggering clause, what the legal term for that is. And it's not optional, right? So if the seller does not comply with this, the buyer will, in fact, be able to get a new survey at the seller's expense. It's not negotiable, right? So if you have a real estate agent that comes to you with an existing survey and they say, can't you just have a T47 signed at closing? You tell them, well, first of all, no. I mean, if you guys have an existing survey and you guys want area and boundaries coverage, which again, we'll get to in a second, we need a T47. But I mean, you guys also executed a sales contract saying that you were supposed to provide the T47 along with the existing survey within X number of days, right? This is a complete surprise to 90% of real estate agents out there. So this is a great way to show your value to your clients when they bring you an existing survey. You know, if you have a listing agent that's your client and they try and shirk the responsibility of T47 to closing, you can say, hey, I mean, we'll do what you want us to do, but just be aware, you know, you might not be in compliance with paragraph 6 if that's the case. You might have just bought a new survey at your seller's expense, right? So I just want to go over that a little bit. Next thing we're going to talk about is survey review and why it takes so long to get a survey reviewed, right? So I guess if you couldn't tell already, there's a lot of pieces of moving information within a survey themselves, right? So one of the most common questions that I get is, why is it taking so long for survey review, right? And admittedly, yes, they are a little bit behind, but truthfully, there are a lot of boxes to check with survey review. And so many boxes that I actually have a checklist for survey review. And I'm not going to go over this checklist in detail, but just know that for every survey that you guys send to survey review, this is all the information that they need to check on it before they have the ability to approve your survey, right? So it's not a quick process. They need to make sure that they are checking all of these proverbial boxes before they actually give you survey approval. Now, just because you work for a company that has an awesome survey review department that will review your survey for you and make changes to Schedule B, you always need to be reviewing your surveys yourself, right? I'm going to give you a perfect example of why you should review your surveys yourself. We had a file in another one of our offices here at Capital Title where a vacant lot contract comes in, right? Nobody knows of any improvement on the property. They think it's just a vacant lot. We get a brand new survey done, right? They send the survey to survey review, and survey review is checking for easements and checking for all these things. And they approve the survey, and we close the transaction. And 6 months later, we find out that, hey, why hasn't the mobile home on the property conveyed with TDHDA? And we say, what mobile home? But then we look back at the survey, and it very, very clearly says manufactured home, right? So even though survey review is really concerned with reviewing easements and setback lines and making sure monuments are there, you need to make sure that you're reviewing it yourself, right? So in that example, we could have seen that there was a manufactured home on that property and avoided the issue altogether if we had just reviewed the survey ourselves. It's very easy to fall into this trap where you know you have a survey review department, you're just going to throw the survey into file scan, let them review it and move on with your day. That's not a best practice, right? You are setting yourself up to be caught in a situation that's super unique and couldn't see coming if you don't just take the minute to look at them yourself, right? It's awesome that we have a survey review department, but they are there ultimately to assist you and not do it for you. So just be super careful. And I will definitely make sure that after today's webinar that everybody will have a copy of this survey review checklist as well. So you can save that to your files if you'd like it. I'm not saying that you need to start completing one of these checklists for every survey, but it does help to at least look at it just to make sure that, again, it's going to be acceptable, right? You know, is there a seal? Is there a signature? Are there setback lines? Is there a legal description on it? It's, again, making sure you see those things before you submit it to survey review will save you a little bit of time. And again, if you have questions on this, contact me directly. I'm happy to talk about it. Last thing we're going to talk about for today is some common title policy endorsements for surveys themselves. And we're going to talk about the area and boundaries exception, the T19, T19.1, what that means, the T23, which is an access endorsement, and the T25, which is a contiguity endorsement. These are a compromised list of the 4 most common endorsements that you issue when it comes to a survey themselves, where these endorsements rely on the survey itself in order to actually be issued. Now, the very first one, the area and boundaries exception, is the most common question that we get all the time, as we know. We know that it's, again, considered survey coverage, right? But what exactly is the amendment to exception to area and boundaries? Well, it's survey coverage that's additional to the policy and it protects the purchaser against errors on the survey. Now, these errors could possibly be one of these 4 following here. If they have a dispute with adjoining landowners over the location of the boundary lines, if they're forced to remove improvements along boundary lines, if they're forced to remove driveways that potentially encroach onto adjoining property, and if they have improvements that are encroaching into easements or building setback lines that are due to matters not disclosed on a survey, right? So if we're looking at all 4 of these items as plain language, those seem like pretty big deals, right? And it seems like if I was purchasing a piece of property, I would absolutely want to be protected against that. Now, as far as the procedural rule and the rate rule, as far as how much money we have to collect and what we need with it, right? So we're going to start with procedural rule P2. That's saying that you need to have a T47 along with an existing survey if you're to be issuing the amendment to exception to area and boundaries, right? So if you're getting an existing survey and they're purchasing the survey coverage on the contract, not only is the T47 a requirement under the sales contract, but now it becomes a requirement in order for us to actually issue that endorsement, right? So on the Trek 1 to 4 family form, where it has that checkbox for, you know, the area and boundaries will be amended at the expense of the buyer or seller, that's really what this is saying. Now, Rate Rule R16 tells us how much money we have to collect for these endorsements. And this is, I will say in advance, the most common loss we see company-wide, right? Because this endorsement, the actual amount changes depending on what type of owner's policy you're issuing, right? So we talked a couple months ago about how to determine whether or not you're issuing a residential or a non-residential owner's policy. So residential being T1R and a non-residential being Form T1, right? So if you're issuing a residential policy, the cost for the amendment to exception to area and boundaries is 5% of the basic rate. So what that means, it's 5% of the total premium you're collecting for the owner's policy, if it's a residential policy. However, if you're issuing a non-residential policy or a T1, it goes to 15%, right? So what we see more often than not is, you know, sure, the premium itself doesn't actually change whether you have a residential policy or a non-residential policy, but the endorsements are completely different. So we'll see where it's a non-residential policy, but they collect the A and B coverage at the residential rate, and we end up having to take a couple $100s in a loss to pay for this endorsement. And truthfully, that's an escrow error. So if there's anything to remember about this, just know that the area and boundaries coverage, the survey coverage, along with the T19, we'll get to that in a second, the cost for those endorsements depends on what type of policy you're issuing, right? So that's why it's extra, you need to be extra careful when you're determining which type of policy you're issuing, right? Again, the rule is if it's residential real property and you're insured, your buyer is a natural person, you can issue a residential policy. But if both of those pieces of information are not satisfied, you must issue a non-residential policy, right? So Form T1. Again, any questions on this, let me know in the chat, or you can just approach me afterwards. So generally, the most common question I get from real estate agents and loan officers and even title insurance professionals is really what's the best protection for a buyer when it comes to survey coverage. So I'm going to go over these here. The first and best option is to obtain a new survey and purchase survey coverage, because that way, if there is anything wrong with the survey, the buyer could come after the seller, the surveyor, and the title company, right? They have 3 times to make their damages right. They have 3 different opportunities for them to recover any potential loss that they might have incurred due to the results of there being an error on the survey, right? Number 2 is to obtain a new survey and do not purchase survey coverage. That's the second best option, because if there's an error on the survey there, the buyer could go after the seller and the surveyor. Now, they wouldn't be able to come after us, the title company, but they'd still have some sort of recourse. that, they probably be more lucky with the surveyor than the seller, but nonetheless. Third best option is to use an existing survey with the T47 and you purchase survey coverage, right? That way, if there's an error on the survey, they can come after the seller and the title company. But because it's not a brand new survey, because again, surveys are made for the person that they're originally drawn for, right? So if you're using an existing survey, you can't go back to the surveyor because they didn't draw that survey for us. Item number 4, and the least protection that you can have for a buyer, is to use an existing survey with T47 and not purchase survey coverage. This is the worst option, obviously, because if they don't have that survey coverage, the only people that they could pursue if they have any damages that they incur as a result of an error on a survey is the seller. And as all of us know as title professionals, good luck finding the seller and good luck finding the abilities for them to pay you what you're owed, right? That's just not something we see very often. So if you get that question, this is something that you can tell your clients to, again, be of value to your clients and help them understand what is truthfully not so much of a complex endorsement, but can be highly confusing if you don't have familiarity with it. Next one we're going to talk about here is the T19 and T19.1. These are also highly common endorsements that go onto either an owner's policy or a loan policy. The T19 will go onto a loan policy. The T19.1 goes onto an owner's policy. And really, these endorsements cover issues in regards to minerals, encroachments, and restrictions. And so the shorthand here is MER, right? So if you hear MER or MER, that's minerals, encroachments, and restrictions. So as far as minerals are concerned, the T19 or T19.1 possibly covers damages to the improvements on a property caused by a future exercise of a right to use the surface for extraction or development of minerals, right? So if they have an oil rig all of a sudden in their backyard, they're mining oil because somebody has mineral interests, the T19 would protect or cover the insured from that, right? Now, generally speaking, if there's not already an oil rig in the backyard, they're probably good, right? There's nobody that's going to go back there. It's highly uncommon on residential property. We're really talking like acreage here or commercial, but even then it's very, very unlikely that they're not aware of at least any mineral rights on the property. And you need to remember that title companies don't insure mineral rights really, but we will protect them from damages with the T19. Now, encroachments is the next out of the MER, right? M for minerals, E for encroachments. And this includes provisions for certain encroachment issues on a property, such as them having to remove an improvement because of a setback line violation shown on the plat or in the real property records, or an encroachment of the improvement into an easement, right? The house is on an electric easement, or an encroachment of an improvement into neighboring land, right? So maybe their house is on somebody else's property, right? That would cover them from things not shown on the survey, right? The last topic here in the R, right, is for restrictions. And this provides provisions for the enforcement of existing restrictions, such as the violation of restrictions that were present at closing but not disclosed by the HOA, or first right to refusal, or unpaid assessments, right? So if any of those things rise up, the T19 or the T19.1 would insure against that, right? Now, the hard thing to understand is really if the matter is present on the survey, right? So if we know that there's, an encroachment into the neighbor's property, and we know there's an encroachment into an easement, generally speaking, we're going to accept to that on the final title policy. And the thing to remember here is that we are not in the business of just paying for construction or paying improvements, right? The title policy itself protects your ownership in the property, right? So if the buyer and seller are very well aware of an issue prior to closing and the buyer chooses to close on that transaction anyway, then why should we really be on the hook for that, right? Because we don't, it's not like a homeowner's insurance policy. We don't pay out for damages in regards to that. We pay out for damages in regards to ownership issues, or if there are, again, matters not disclosed on the survey properly. But generally speaking, if it's disclosed on the survey and the buyer has knowledge of it beforehand, I'm almost going to guarantee going to end up as an exception on the final policy, meaning we're not going to cover it. If you're having trouble understanding why that is, let me know or type it in the chat. But that's pretty common sense stuff. Just know that a lot of people, I've had many people even in the past couple of weeks approach me expecting us to pay for things that they were aware of when they took possession of this property. And this just kind of hurts my brain as to why they could think that. But I just want to go ahead and disclose that so we're all aware. Now, the T19 and T19.1 are much like the area and boundaries coverage. They depend, as far as the cost is concerned, on which type of policy you're issuing, right? So if you're issuing a residential policy or a T1R, the cost is 5% of the basic rate or the total premium. If it's a non-residential policy, again, it's a 10% of the basic rate for the T1. Now, what I want to show you really quick is in your endorsement screen, you're going to notice, and probably already have, that when you're pulling endorsements for this, you're going to notice that there are multiple options, both for the area and boundaries coverage and the T19. So we're going to look at the area and boundaries coverage first. You're going to see that there are two options for the survey amendment, right? One says non-residential, one says residential. So you're going to want to make sure you select the one that applies to the type of policy you're issuing. The same is true for the T19 and the T19.1. You're going to see on the T19 that there is one for residential and there is one for non-residential, right? So when you're pulling your endorsements onto your prelim or closing disclosure using for closing, be sure that you're selecting the right one. Again, between the area and boundaries coverage and the T19 being selected at the wrong rate, that is the most common loss that we see across the entire company. And it's a really easy one to make. Like, it's a very easy mistake to make if you're going too fast, right? But again, slow down and make sure that we're selecting the correct endorsement. Two more endorsements we're going to talk about here, and then we'll be finished. But these are a little less common of endorsements, but I still want to go over them because they're common in regards to the survey, right? Starting with the contiguity endorsement. And really, this amends the policy to provide coverage that boundaries of two or more tracts in the policy are contiguous, right? That they're touching. There's no gaps, there's no strips, there's no gores, they abut against each other, right? So there are two tracts that you're ensuring that they're right next to each other, that they abut to each other. Now, the contiguity endorsement itself can only be issued with a loan policy or a non-residential policy itself. It cannot be issued where there's residential real property. So again, you're probably going to see this more commonly on commercial deals. But again, if you have a deal that doesn't have residential real property, you very well might be asked to issue a contiguity endorsement if you're being asked to insure multiple tracts, right? Generally speaking, the title company can add any exceptions to the endorsement that it considers. Not something you're really going to have to worry about. That's more for abstract and exam. And again, this can only be used on non-residential land. And if you have a weird situation where you're being asked to issue a contiguity endorsement where there's 4 or more parcels, or maybe the parcels are a weird shape, get with underwriting. There's something we can do about that. We can issue a different contiguity endorsement, but again, this is highly uncommon. Just want you guys to know that this applies to a survey itself. And procedural rule 56 is really the rule that goes into detail about the contiguity endorsement. And rate rule 32, R32 rather, is details the cost for this endorsement. It's pretty simply $100 per policy, right? So it doesn't really matter if it's, you know, on a loan policy or an owner's policy. It's $100 no matter what. Now, as far as underwriting requirements are concerned for this endorsement, you cannot, again, have residential real property with a contiguity endorsement. You have to have an acceptable survey, and that survey has to certify the tracts to be covered as contiguous along their common boundary line. So again, contiguous means touching, right? They have to have this, they have to share the same boundary line, and they have to be touching. And then again, each tract that is to be insured has to be endorsed, right? So you have one endorsement per tract. And if you have, again, tracts that are only partially contiguous, like they're only kind of touching, or 4 or more parcels, or they're regular shaped parcels, again, contact underwriting. They'll point you in the right direction. Or you can ask me, I'll point you in the right direction too. Last one we're talking about today is the T23. That's the access endorsement. And this really adds coverage in the policy in regards to actual physical access to a street, road, or highway, right? It insures against loss if the land does not abut and have vehicular and pedestrian access to and from a named street, road, or highway. This is basically saying that we're insuring the buyer that they'll have access, both vehicular and pedestrian, to a roadway, right? So if this is something that you're being asked to issue, we're going to need to make sure that we have a current survey showing that the property to be insured abuts to the road, street, or highway to be named in the endorsement, right? So the endorsement says, we're insuring you that you have access to this street, right? So we need to have a survey that shows that. The survey should also reflect the name of the road, street, or highway. And it also must reflect that that's open to physical travel by both vehicular and pedestrian means, right? So it can't just be a walkway. They got to be able to drive a car through there. Now, as far as the access endorsement is concerned itself, it's really discussed in procedural rule P54. It's really just saying, again, what we went over before. We need to have a survey that shows the street name. We need to have a survey that shows that there's clear access to that street. And rate rule R30 says that the cost for these endorsements are $100 for each policy, right? So if you're being asked to issue one on the owner's policy and one on the loan policy, you'd collect it twice, right? One for the owners, one for the loan. Again, this is another endorsement where it needs to be on non-residential policy as well. It cannot be residential real property. So contiguity endorsement, access endorsements, they can't be on residential real property. So again, that's why I say they're a little less common, but you know, we do see commercial deals come in time and again. And it's good to know exactly what these endorsements are, because when you do have a commercial deal that is going to request this, they are 100% going to request these endorsements to make sure that they're covered. So it's just good to know what these are, even if you don't typically close commercial deals. That being said, that's pretty much it, guys. That's all I really wanted to talk about today. We're about 3 minutes short of an hour. Again, thank you for attending this afternoon. I'm going to circulate a quiz shortly afterwards with a bunch of information. The survey checklist, I'm going to give you the TOO cheat sheet, I'm going to give you the TOO county code table. Just be sure that you turn that quiz in by end of day tomorrow in order to receive credit for the session. If you are going to have an issue getting that into me by the end of the day tomorrow, email me directly. I can work with you. Like if your workload is a little too high or you have some people out on your team and you need more time, that's totally fine. Let me know. I'm just going to give everybody a couple more minutes. If you have any more questions, just go ahead and type them into the chat. Happy to address them. I'm also going to address a couple questions that were asked in the earlier session this morning, just to make sure we're all sharing the information. So again, thank you guys for attending. I'm going to give it a couple minutes and then we'll wrap this up.